the West Bank. And I'm referring to settler violence, which is in the uptick, and injustice done by the security forces as well. At the same time, there's violence done on behalf of terrorists in the West Bank. But we've got to keep that in mind. We can't let that be left aside. My view. And when we study, I think we increase our ability to understand other positions. Today's study is quite different than what we've done until now, and you've seen that it only contains a few verses in Proverbs and a page and a half from Midrash Tanchuma. In the past, I've spoken a little bit of the work that I did as a relatively older student. I was in my 40s when I was working on a PhD at Hebrew University in the Jewish literature department. I had gone from the Bible department, where I did my BA and MA, to work with my good friend and teacher Avigdor Shenan, who's really a world famous scholar of Midrash and prayer. And I was pushed by a lot of people to do this PhD. My father, of blessed memory, Rabbi Herzl Fishman, of blessed memory, Zakovich and Shenan, my good friends and teachers, they also, there seemed to be a lot of pressure, and I had a 2-year fellowship. So I was encouraged by that fellowship also. I think they paid even the tuition at Hebrew University. And I got quite a bit done, all the coursework done and a lot of the research done. But when it came time to write, I was already back in the field running Rikma, the organization that I had founded with Eli Wortman and Jacob Ner David for leadership training, rabbinic leadership training. And I was already wanting to be back in the field in a congregation. I hadn't yet moved down to Tel Aviv, but eventually what happened was I had a lot of research, no writing, and I just decided that it's too much pressure for me. I went back to being just a regular old rabbi. This was the background. Many people have heard the story of how I got to Taizé, where I'll be visiting in a few weeks to my annual pilgrimage there to study with the brothers of Taizé. And I got there originally, it was in order to hand in the first chapter, to work on that first chapter that I never finished. That was in 2001, and that's soon after that I kind of gave up the whole thing. But I do have lots in my mind. It turns out I have almost nothing I have nothing in English. The only things I have were in Hebrew. And I went back to some of that material to share with you my love of Midrash Tanchuma, this particular genre of homiletic Midrash, and how I first met these verses in Proverbs that we have here, because as I've told you before, I've never studied Proverbs from beginning to end before. And we'll get to that in a moment, but because we're going to be taking off, we won't be meeting next week. Next week, Jews do the blues. I'll just have too many things that I've got to do that day. And then Sasha and I are leaving for Israel, and then I'll be going into France. So we'll be off for probably almost all of December. We'll let folks know exactly when. But what I will be doing in Taizé this year, they've asked me to share with them. They know that I was teaching Joshua overlapping with this war, with much of the war that was going on already, and that dynamic, and many of you were there in those sessions. And I'm going to kind of choose the greatest hits of the complexity of studying such a biblical text as Joshua about the conquest of the land in the background of this war, having to do with conquest as well, and imperialism, and lots of thoughts. So I'll let you know afterwards how it went. Every time I present to the brothers of Taizé, I learn something new, because they come at this material with such a different direction than I do. And also in preparing it for the context of being there at the monastery, it's a different experience than it was preparing it for you folks. Okay, But before we get to our material today, are there any comments or questions about what we did the last time we met? Okay, we're just going to do these few verses from chapter 6 today. And Malka, Rabbi Malka, if you'd read for them, read them for us, 6:16 to 19.
God hates 6 things and abominates 7: a haughty bearing, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a mind that hatches evil plots, feet quick to run to evil, a false witness testifying lies, and one who incites sibling to quarrel.
Okay. About that, the siblings at the end, I just want to know that I'm not sure everybody would translate siblings, would be fellow human beings, neighbors, achim, brothers, not in the genealogical meaning, but as people close to each other. But we'll get to these things. So the format is 6 and 7, and we're going to see other 6 and 7s. We're going to see also the format 3 and 4, which I've spoken about before. That was Yair Zakovich's PhD dissertation that, as far as I know, never came out in book form. Yair has a kind of a principle that once he's published something, he wants to be done with it and doesn't want to, I think, milk it for everything you can get out of it, as some scholars do, which we all benefit from, by the way. But it's a matter of principle for him. He also has another principle that I once discovered by chance, that he had an article in German called entitled Tods Sisra, which is the death of Sisra. And I tried to read it with the German I had been studying at the time, got so far, I said, where will I find this article in Hebrew? He says, nowhere. So what do you mean? He says, I said, well, what's going on here? He says, I wanted to see if I could write an article in German. I wanted to see if my German was good enough to write an article. So he writes the piece in German. I said, well, why don't you translate? He says, no, that's my rule. I don't translate. I think since then his wife Valerie has convinced him to translate some things. But so Yair pointed out that the form, which is common, the 3 to 4 form, and he relates, I think, to the 6 and 7 form as well. It's a literary device. It's a mnemonic device. Yair points out that it's used in wisdom literature, but it's also used as a format in narrative and I think poetry as well. But I think his main point was narrative, biblical narrative, and gives many examples that we've brought up in the past. That's not our topic today. The idea, though, that you have this mnemonic device of how people remember, and also to emphasize that last one. There's 6 things that are and the 7th is okay? Or there's 3 things that are and the 4th is I'm purposely going because it could be negative or it could be positive or just different. And if we look at it that way, so these 6 things, the first 6 things, are all kind of lousy things, but it would lead us to, if that indeed is true, the 7th is all the more so, then it feels like what the verse is saying is that one who incites others to quarrel amongst themselves, that's the worst. That's the worst. Now, I don't know, because shedding innocent blood is pretty bad. So I'm not sure this holds here, but in any case, that's the tradition we have. So any comments or reactions to that before we get to what Midrash, how the Midrash makes use of it? Does this kind of saying remind anybody of something they grew up with? Any kinds of things that were taught as children that they believe in? Not and yes, Malka.
If I see something that seems redundant, I guess from the rabbinical interpretation, it says a false witness testifying lies. Well, a false witness is one who testifies lies. So I wonder why they had to say testifying lies. Seems redundant.
Or it's in order to emphasize. If you look in the Hebrew, yafiach
Yeah.
sabri, right? Who yafiach is not just testified, but it's kind of spread
Mhm.
lies.
Mm.
That's what that's what maybe it's intensification. I don't know. Do you have an explanation?
No, but I was going to go see what I'm sure they picked up on. I was going to see what they said about it.
Yeah, but I look at we have a lot of parallels here, right? If we
Mhm.
look in first of all the opening thing is parallel, right? God hates,
Mhm.
God abominates, right? That's the first two lines. Um, and then there's not a naim ramot is a naim ramot says here a haughty being, but the literal is eyes, something to do with the eyes, lifting up one's eyes, or maybe rolling one's eyes. That might be where it comes from. Lashon shaker, evil or a deceitful tongue, right? Yadayim shofchot dam naki, hands that,
Mhm.
just like the translation, and but then it gets two parallels. Lev choresh, machshavot avin. A lev choresh already is negative. Is the heart is doing something negative, and what's the negative thing they're doing? Those machshavot avin. The feet are run. No, I guess not. It's not parallel. The feet are running to do something wrong. Yeah, the aid checker. So you would want it just to say aid yafiach savim.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, good point. Let's see. I don't think, yeah, let's see what the Midrash understands from this. And not that the Midrash is looking for the simple meaning of the text, of course. Any other comments on this?
Abominate 7. It's confusing. It says God hates 6 things and abominates 7. Now, to what end is?
Yeah, it's like there's three things that I really dislike about you, but the fourth is the worst. If I was talking to you, right?
Yeah.
It's just it's a form, it's a literary form or an oral form in order to remember things. And the two ones that I know of are 6 and 7, 3 and 4. I don't know of a 10 and an 11 or a 1 and a 2. And so
And
I
Amos, for
what's
three
that?
transgressions and for four, Amos, he repeats
Right,
that repeatedly.
right. So and that's kind of akin to wisdom literature, right?
This
Prophetic.
is unusual.
What part in particular?
Siblings to quarrel. Interesting.
That's unusual, but there's nothing wrong with it. I just never seen that before.
Yeah. Well, it is ancient literature, and I don't remember if this is the 4 and 5, the 3 and 4, or the 6 and 7 model appears in other ancient Near Eastern literature. I kind of just focused on the Midrash today. Yes, Les.
At least in the English, the second sentence makes it sound like he abominates all 7, not just one. So is the Hebrew different? In
No,
other words, he hates 6 things, but he abominates 7 things
right.
other than the 7th thing.
Yeah, I think that what's intended here, what's hinted at, is the seventh. But there's 7 because it's not like there's a list of 6 and then a list of 7.
Mhm.
There's only a list of 7, and it leads one to believe that the seventh is the worst. Although, as I mentioned before, I'm not sure how inciting quarrel among siblings is worse than shedding innocent blood, but perhaps that's the point. Maybe that is his point. Yeah.
Maybe the person who incites brothers to quarrel, maybe that they can incite all the rest of the things, a haughty bear, their haughty bearing, they can incite a lying tongue, they can do that by all those means, shed innocent blood, hatch
Yeah.
evil plots.
I think that's a good point. That's a good point. But I want us just to be about the siblings thing. I want us, although we in the church today, my friends, my clergy friends, they use our siblings in faith. They use that instead of saying brothers in faith or brothers and sisters in faith because there's not everybody's gender identifying. Um, that it's I don't want us to think it's actual brothers and sisters, right? From the same family. It's your fellow human being, I think would be but let's see what the Midrash does with this, okay? And Dan, I'm glad you're here. I'm going to make good use of you today. You're kind of our designated hitter when it comes to rabbinic literature. But this is a lot to read. So why don't you give it a start? So Midrash Tanchuma, a few words. Mentioned it before. It's really a genre and not a particular corpus. So in Sefaria, if you're looking for Midrash Tanchuma, you see there's two files there. One is Tanchuma and one is Tanchuma Buber. and the background to that is that we have a tradition of a printed Midrash Tanchuma from 17th century. I think is probably the earliest, maybe a little bit before, I don't remember. And that printed one is based on a particular manuscript. Then Shlomo Buber, Martin Buber's grandfather, who was an expert at manuscripts and was searching all over Europe in different Vatican, Leningrad, different places for manuscripts. He came across a manuscript of Tanchuma, which was quite different than the one that was in the printed edition. So he published that together with his notes from other Tanchuma manuscripts, and that became known as Tanchuma, Midrash Tanchuma Buber. And then with time, in the Geniza fragments, or the collections of Geniza for that documenting literature from the ancient land of Israel custom community in Cairo, they found still more versions and manuscripts. And what happened in the end, eventually people decided that Tanchuma wasn't a book, it was a genre of midrash, of homiletic midrashim. That is, it kind of documents, somehow reflects what was done in the synagogue Shabbat morning in the land of Israel, not in Babylonia, because Babylonia they didn't really do midrash in the morning. They didn't have drashot b'tzibur, public sermons, but in the land of Israel they did, and they also, as many of you know, they read the Torah portion that spread out over 3.5 years, not over 1 year, as it was done in Babylonia. So what we find in Midrash Tanchuma, what is already found in earlier Midrashim like Leviticus Rabbah, Vayikra Rabbah, is that these homilies are based on a smaller Torah portion. They don't cover all of it, but we know from the way it opens, very much the way it opens. Tanchuma is unique in that many of the homilies don't begin necessarily by quoting a verse from the prophets or quoting a verse from the Torah portion, but actually with a question, a halachic question, as if the synagogue, they just read the Torah, or maybe they're going to read it before. It's not clear. And then somebody gets up, Rabbi, could you tell us exactly? It's Rosh Chodesh tomorrow. Do we say this halal or that halal? Or tell us, Rabbi, what day exactly do we circumcise a boy? Now, sometimes the questions seem to reflect a reality, a possible reality, but often the questions seem to be a plant that somebody says, when we get to you ask the question, right? Like in TV shows, live audience TV shows. And that way the homilist, the speaker, the given person giving the sermon can use that question as a springboard to talk about what he wants to talk about. And that's what we have here. And that's what's unique about Midrash Tanchuma. And that caught my mind as a student because it reflected something in the synagogue, something I would have loved to have done. I didn't do it exactly this way because I'm less of a formalist, but I do know somebody that did it this way. Some of you perhaps have run into Amichai Lau, Rabbi Amichai Lau, or Lavi, Lau Lavi on the internet, different things. A movie's just coming out about him as the Shabbat drag queen or something like that. His uncle was and his cousin were chief rabbis of Israel. He's an interesting fellow. And the years that he wasn't a rabbi yet, the years he was in New York when I first met him in the late 90s, he was doing something like this at Congregation B'nai Jeshurun, Upper West Side. And he did this kind of a thing, this kind of translating and midrash. Anyway, let's take, by the time we get Tanchuma, which is probably from the 5th, 6th century, some people put it later, I would put it from 5th, 6th century of the Common Era. By the time we get to it, it's already a literary composition that's been polished a little bit. Doesn't necessarily reflect how it was said in the synagogue. But let's take a look at that. And it goes you find it according to the Torah portion. And then within the Torah portion, there's different like subheadings or chapters. If you look closely, you'll find it's, let's leave it at that. I'm going into too much detail. Let's see what it says in Vayikra 6. This is the Torah portion that talks about the Korban Chatat, which used to be translated the sin offering. And it's there's 4 cases One is when somebody unintentionally sins. One is when the community unintentionally sins. One is when the priest unintentionally sins, and one is when the leader unintentionally sins. And what's the details of the sacrifice? Now, the time that Tanhuma is happening, there are no sacrifice, right? So the actual details of the sacrifice are not what interests the speaker. He wants to talk about something else. And let's see how he gets there. Go ahead, Dan.
The Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, when the soul sins by mistake, let our master instruct us. Is it right for one to enter the Temple Mount with his staff or his money girdle? Thus have our masters taught in Bereshit, or Brachot. Sorry.
Brachot.
One may not enter the Temple Mount with his staff, his money girdle, or with dust on his feet, lest he treat it with disrespect, even in its destruction.
Okay, so this could be a practical question. Somebody lives in the area of Jerusalem. Am I allowed to go onto the Temple Mount? It's certainly a question that's asked since the 6-Day War in Israel, and grows more and more popular with the current government, people in charge of the police, etc. But you can't just go like anywhere. You've got to be careful how you appear. And this also gives you some indication as to what you do when you go into a synagogue as well, although that's not the law. The Mishnah, which is always quoted, it's almost always a question, this hypothetical question, and the answer comes from a Tanaitic source, in this case, the Mishnah. It's usually the Mishnah, not always, but the vast majority of the cases. And this spells out, no, you can't just walk through there. Maybe it reflects some sort of idea of when you come to a synagogue as well. You don't just, it's like those of us that taught teenagers, for instance, remember the issues of having mostly the boys take off their jackets or their hoodies or their hats inside. It's kind of like, I wear a hat on the street, but when I sit down at a restaurant, it's very rare that I wear that. I don't abide by. I can't. It's hard for me to certain things. You take off your hat or you take off your coat, or you don't. You keep your gun at the door or whatever it might. You keep it covered. So here, that's in the background, but that's just the question. That's probably the plant, right? He says, and the rabbi says, ask me that question. So then he can give the answer, and then go ahead.
The Holy One, blessed be he, said in Leviticus, you shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. And what was the reason for comparing keeping the Sabbath with the sanctuary? Thus did Rabbi Chia the Great teach, just as keeping the Sabbath is forever, so is reverence for the sanctuary forever.
Okay, so this is relating to the Mishnah. It's giving a comment on the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, even in its destruction, you have to respect the place of the temple in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount. You say, yeah, but the temple's destroyed. Why? Oh, that I learned, says Rabbi Chia, that I learned that from this connection between, it says Shabbat and sanctuary in the same breath. So in the same way, Shabbat is forever, not dependent upon the existence of the temple. So is the sanctity of the sanctuary. Okay? Tried to divide this into paragraphs that would be step by step. Go ahead.
Solomon cried out in Ecclesiastes, to the place of justice, thither came wickedness. Solomon was observing how the wicked subverted justice in the sanctuary. Solomon said, the place where the Sanhedrin sat to judge criminal law, civil law, decisions on scourgings, and decisions on clean and unclean, there they defiled it. See what's written in Jeremiah. Then all the officers of the king of Babylon came and sat in the middle gate, the Gral Sarzer, Samgar Nebo, Sarsechim the Rabsaris, and Lamentations, because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate, the jackals walk over it. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, you name those entering, but you do not name those leaving. In Ecclesiastes 3:16, to the place of justice, thither came wickedness.
Okay, not all that important for us, a little bit complicated. It could be the text is lacking here, but basically the idea is this. He's gone from the question in Halakha to quoting a Mishnah, then quoting another verse from Leviticus that helps him clarify something in the Mishnah, that it's forever. And then he says, it's kind of like he says, oh, you know what? That reminds, it's like me speaking, right? Always going off on a tangent. He says, that's kind of, that reminds me. I added those words, of course. You know, there's this verse in Ecclesiastes, which Solomon says, right? And Solomon is also called out to be the author in Midrash, in rabbinic literature, both of Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Proverbs. Lamentations is thought to be by Jeremiah in rabbinic literature. And so he says, oh, that reminds you, this particular verse, you know, to the place of justice came the wickedness. Well, what is that about? He says, well, Solomon was prophesying what's going to happen during the destruction of the first temple, where the Babylonians, these horrible rats, these guys, these guys we hate, these Babylonian generals, they're sitting in the midst of the temple. That's kind of the example that he gives. In the same place that was holy, where, and interesting what makes it holy. He doesn't say the place where the sacrifices were offered. He says the place where the Sanhedrin gave law. It's almost as if he's projecting, the Midrash is projecting what's holy in his time, not almost. It seems as the speaker is projecting what's holy in his time, which is judging between people, deciding what's right and wrong, pure and impure, whatever, is the source of sanctity, as opposed to these others, these Gentile soldiers that are sitting in the place that it should be. And then is reminded of another verse in Lamentations that talks about how the foxes or the jackals walk in that holy place as well. So he's kind of made one point about the fulfillment of that verse, to the place of justice, thither came wickedness. That's a verse that's going to accompany us now for a number of paragraphs. Go ahead.
Should priest and prophet be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord? Here is the blood of Zechariah shed on the stones, as stated in Ezekiel. For her blood was in her midst, she set it upon bare rock.
All right. So this is a great example of how the copier of the manuscript of this is from Tanhuma, but I don't think it wasn't the printer. I think this is what the printer was working off the manuscript, abbreviated an expansion, abbreviated a more complicated message. And the message here was to talk about, he says, I have another example of how that place of sanctity was messed up by something evil that happened there. And this refers to, he uses the springboard for that as another verse from Lamentations, but a story about this man named Zechariah, who was slaughtered in who was a good guy, who was slaughtered in the temple, and his blood gurgled up. And that's a whole, there's books about that, how common that tradition is. It also comes up in a different way in the New Testament. But whoever was copying this manuscript decided it doesn't interest him. So what he did, he just gave the just bullet points of the story. We're not going to go into it. I had an entire section on this, right? The traditions that this is referring to, but maybe that's for another time. And in doing so, he brings this verse from Ezekiel, which has nothing to do with that, right? This is Ezekiel's prophecy about the children of Israel who were like a baby who was, who was born in the middle of the wilderness, and God took care of her. All right, it's a verse that we have in the Passover Seder. But now let's go on. So another interpretation. We're going to see this is very common. Another interpretation, and we don't know if the other interpretation is actually from the way this was given, the homily was given in the synagogue, or most probably it was added by whoever edited this particular homily. It says, oh, I know another interpretation. Go ahead.
Another interpretation of Ecclesiastes 3:16. To the place of justice, thither came wickedness. This is the central gate in which the great Sanhedrin sat. Thither came wickedness. In Lamentations, her gates have sunk into the ground. The Holy One, blessed be he, said in the same verse, to the place of justice, thither came wickedness. There was one place for the righteous one of the world, the holy temple, which was set apart for the divine presence. Then Manasseh wronged it, and brought an image into its midst.
Okay, so another example of how the place was defiled. A story of Manasseh in Kings. bringing in the idol into the temple itself. Doesn't develop the point, but it's almost like, oh, I'll give you another next thing. It could be, it's almost as if the person recording this or the person speaking in person is showing off with how much they know about how many different possible midrashic interpretations or expansions of this verse in Ecclesiastes is. Go ahead, next one.
Another interpretation, same verse, to the place of justice. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, I created the soul, and it is delivered into my hand, as stated in Job, in whose hand is every living soul. And justice also is delivered into my hand, as stated in Deuteronomy. My hand lays hold on justice. But I only delivered the soul next to judgment in my hand, so that it might see what is fitting for it and not sin. Yet it does sin, coming back to Ecclesiastes, thither came wickedness. When the soul sins, for the soul is placed next to judgment.
So finally, he's gotten to the Torah portion, right? That's what it started with, and that's kind of and the art is how he wove his way from that ostensibly innocent, naive question about where are we allowed to walk on the Temple Mount even in these days, the days of destruction, and weaves his way back into this Torah portion. And some would say, and that's how the Torah portion was presented. And therefore it says, nefesh ki techta, when a soul sins. Because you have to ask, why would a soul sin if the nefesh comes from God? And this is an important theological point. So then why would there be sin if that's where the nefesh comes from? So this is not about well, it is about free choice, and it's kind of about it already raises this tension between the body and the soul. It's almost as if the body is liable to sin, but the soul is there to keep it straight. And that tension in every human being, in every soul. Okay. Yeah. All right. Now he continues on this line. Talking about
That
nefesh.
which,
Soul.
okay. That which scripture stated in Proverbs 19:2, also a soul without knowledge is not good, and one who hastens with the feet is a sinner, is to say that when someone sins, even by mistake, it is not a good sign for him. How so? There were two stores before him, one belonging to a stranger and one belonging to Israel. If he entered the one belonging to the stranger without knowing it, it's not good. If he entered deliberately, he's called a sinner, as stated in Proverbs, and one who hastens with the feet is a sinner.
Okay, so a section from Proverbs, which we haven't done, but you can hear already, is similar, is parallel in some way to what our verse says, the reason that we got here in the first place. We'll get back to our verse in that we started with today. Well, don't worry. But you might have the question, what's wrong with going into the store of a Gentile? That's the word, is of a nochri, of a Gentile. What's wrong with going into the store of a Gentile? Anybody? It's talking about a food store, and other manuscripts is talking about a butcher store. It says I'm pretty sure it says it's explicitly butcher. And so if you go into if there's for instance there's a case in the Talmud that says if you're in the marketplace and there are 10 stalls of meat, 9 of them are kosher and 1 of them is not, and you bought meat and then you don't remember which one you got it from. So in modern day laws of kosher, in your neighborhood, Eileen, what would they say? If there's any doubt whatsoever, you shouldn't eat the meat, right?
Throw it out.
Throw it out. But the Talmud says actually, if one isn't kosher and 9 are, then you can assume it's kosher. And that's something, but that's part of the Talmud. So I think that's kind of the background here. You've got this marketplace. There are different stalls, and you shouldn't intentionally go to that non-kosher one. But if you did and the food came, all right, so then it's not great. But if you go intentionally, then that's the problem. Okay, and already bringing up this idea of the feet of the sinner, the going someplace where your feet steer you to go. It has to do with who you are. If you're a sinner, your feet will be steered to go in the wrong direction. It's kind of what it says. And now expanding on this point, on this idea of feet and right direction, wrong direction, Dan?
Rav Isaac bar Samuel bar Martha said, There were two ways before him, one long and one short. The short one was full of pebbles, but the long one did not have a pebble in it. He left the long one and went by the short one on the Sabbath. Concerning him, it was stated, and one who hastens with the feet is a sinner.
Okay, we didn't have English translations when I was working on this yet, right? I don't think, maybe one was published, but and by the way, all my material for that, it's on some disk someplace, but it's not on this computer. I don't know where my notes, and a lot of the material was on card, and so a huge amount was on cards and index cards. And I don't know if I even have those cards anymore, but I do remember these kinds of things, that in the Hebrew, the word that's translated here, pebble, would better be translated dirt clod. Do you remember dirt clods when we were growing up? When we were little kids, we have a dirt clod fight because I forgot where it was, but they're not hard, right? You throw them at somebody, they explode in dirt. It's kind of like snowballs, but for kids in Southern California where there is no snow. So a dirt clod, what's the connection on Shabbat? A pebble, it doesn't matter if you walk on a pebble on Shabbat. But if you walk, the halacha is if you walk, you're not allowed to walk on, if you don't know what I'm talking about, if anybody's ever been in a freshly plowed field, that might be something also people don't know what I'm talking about, but a freshly plowed field, if you walk on those clods, that's the word we use to kids, maybe is a better word, then you break them down, right? That is considered like grinding. Believe it or not, yes, you can't intentionally walk on a piece of earth that you know will dissolve under your foot, under the weight of your step, on Shabbat, because that's similar to grinding something. That's how the laws of Shabbat are worked out on everything. So that's what's in the background of this. You could have gone one way. You didn't go on the longer way. You went on the shorter way, but it was on Shabbat. And because of that, because you wanted to take a shortcut, you broke the laws of Shabbat. Now, you need to know that background information to understand this little, we'll call it a parable right now. But of course, it's not about walking on dirt clouds on Shabbat. It's about everything in life. You think that there's a shortcut to do, but you end up doing something wrong in the shortcut. By the way, I remember the first Torah trek that I ever created. I'm not, maybe I'm not, I don't know if we called it Torah Trek yet, was in Boulder. I found it in my notes for something now in I think 2002 or 2003. I was in Boulder with a group of my students, and the local community asked if we could go take a walk together, and could you teach some Torah as we took a hike? Then I remember bringing this source. This was on the sheet. I think I came across that sheet now. So, okay, and I'm sorry, I'm not leaving space for questions. I apologize. Any comments or questions, or is this just too overwhelmingly random and irrelevant? Yeah, I know it's different than usual. Just want to bring you guys into this world of Midrash. Midrash is created for people that have a certain set of a certain background of knowledge and things. Otherwise, it doesn't work, right? It's like if you don't know the background to a particular joke, so it needs to be explained to you. And once you have to explain it, then it's no longer as funny. So it's no longer as entertaining as when you're a yeshiva bocher and you're going through this material. And because I did have a yeshiva background when I, started to study this stuff in earnest in the late 80s, it was just it was like, it was just so entertaining and so attractive to me. So anything?
My first impression is that when I think of a drosh, it's sort of a lecture to explain and make simpler a Torah portion or something, whatever. In this case, the midrash makes it more complicated.
But so our goal is, and so the reason it's complicated is because of the background. Because we as a collective don't have the background which the language is being spoken. If we saw this in Hebrew, it would be totally different to us as well, or very different, because we'd also hear words that the Darshan uses and see the word plays that we're skipping over. A lot of this is based on word association between two different verses in two different places, which is very common to rabbinic literature, but not part of our world necessarily. So this is not but to your point, Les, this is not in order to make the Torah portion simpler. This is in order to squeeze the Torah portion for something that you wouldn't have seen if you're just reading it on your own. That's a kind of a different goal. So, you've heard hundreds
Yeah.
of people give Divrei Torah, a drash in your synagogues that you've gone to over the years, right? And there's different styles. Different people have different styles. They want to, but very often there's the ones that find the message.
Amen.
They find the message that they want to give. They find it in what they figure out a way to read it into or read it out of what's in the Torah portion, right? Yes, Roberta.
In this passage where the long and the short way, how is it assumes that you know something about this? I mean, if someone's faced with making a route of wherever they want to go, what difference? I mean, how would they know that they're going the wrong way, that it's wrong to do that?
Yeah, I
They
don't.
could do it by mistake. I mean, in effect, there's two routes. You pick one. You didn't know why is it wrong to go on the pebbles?
Right.
Do they
Well,
know
yeah,
inherently that these
the way that
pebbles are?
the way that it's presented is there were two ways before him. One was long, one was short. The short was, so I think the idea is that the short one was full of dirt clods. He knew that, he could see that, but he
Mhm.
went on it anyway because it was shorter.
Okay.
It's kind of
So-
like if the translation in our world would be, you have a choice of doing the long way or the short way, and you know what's going to happen, but you do the short way anyway because you don't have time.
How do you know that it's bad? It's wrong. It isn't.
You-
Is it implied?
No,
Some-
how do we? No, in this case here, I think it's being described as he could see. He could see. You could, you go on you're looking at two roads. You see this one is overgrown and this one's not. This one has dirt. You see it from the beginning. I think that's the simple way to understand this. But in our own lives, when we decide which way to drive someplace, at least in the old days with maps and things like that, we would look and see where the gas stations are. Where today I'm looking for where the bathrooms are going to be, right? Yeah, I got news for everybody, by the way. The rest stop that we never ever, how many hundreds of times we've driven back and forth between LA and here, and I really needed to go the other night. The rest stop that's like in Beaumont, bathrooms closed at night. I was going to say we're about to find out now. Okay, thankfully it's me and I could go off to the side someplace, but I just want people to know, don't think that the bathroom's going to be open in the rest stop at 11 o'clock or 10:30 at night. Okay. But yeah, that's the kind of things we're looking for, right? Is there a place to eat? Is there a charging station? That's what Les is looking for, right? Is he going to drive someplace? So I think that's the idea. And some people say, well, you know what? Yeah, the Israeli, yeah, beseder, it's going to be all right. We'll just go. We'll go. We need to go quickly. I don't know. In any case, I don't know. It's so deep in any, but it could be just a general kind of a wisdom. One of the things I want to say is that the Midrash is expanding the wisdom lesson here, and the wisdom lesson is don't take shortcuts or be careful. Eileen, did you want to say something?
That's what I was going to say. It seems to me like don't take a shortcut. If you want to learn something, don't read the cliff notes. Read the whole thing. That's
Right.
what
So, says the woman that drives back and forth between here and Chicago, but doesn't take the shortest route.
actually we didn't this time. We're getting older. We kind of went slower.
Oh, but also don't you like visit your kids someplace on the way?
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So one more paragraph, Dan, then I'll give you a break. Go ahead.
Our masters have taught in Avot, one good deed, mitzvah, leads to another, and one transgression leads to another. A person should not worry about a sin which he commits by mistake, but rather that an opening has been made for him to sin again, even deliberately. Moreover, one should not rejoice over a good deed which comes to him for fulfillment, but rather that many good deeds are going to come to him as a result. Therefore, if one has sinned by mistake, it is not a good sign. As stated, also a soul without knowledge is not good. How much the more so if he sins deliberately.
Okay, so before one more thing I want to say about the previous paragraph, Roberta, is that if you went on, if you walked on that shortcut, if you walked on the shortcut, you didn't intend to break down the dirt clods. You wanted to get there, but the collateral damage was something that got you in trouble with Jewish law by doing it on Shabbat. And so that's the nexus of intentionality and accidentality or unintentionality.
So the person knew that breaking down the clods was wrong?
Yeah, he knows that you're not allowed to do it on Shabbat, but did he go there to break down the clods? No, he went there to get to the other side. But it's kind of like, you know that turning on the light in the Orthodox world, that opening up the refrigerator is going to turn on the light. You know that. You could say, but I'm not, I'm opening up the refrigerator to get a Coke. I'm not opening to get a beer. I'm not opening to turn on the light, except for the light is turned on. And so that's something that, and since you knew that it was going to turn on, then you should have known. It's that nexus between intentionality and unintentionality. It's like you're mad at somebody for doing something and they say, yeah, it's not like you did it intentionally. I said, yes, but you weren't careful, were you? Right? You still crashed into the other guy, didn't you? Because you were looking at your phone or whatever. Of course, you didn't intend to get in an accident. All right. So on this particular idea is that this is, I think, a really interesting from a wisdom point of view. It's not that when you do a mitzvah and you do something, then mitzvah goreret mitzvah, right? One mitzvah pulls another one after it, right? My understanding of that has always been, and avira goreret avira, says Pirkei Avot, and I've learned this stuff since I was a kid, 13 years old, right? Is that you build a culture of doing something. The more you do a particular thing, you build a culture of doing that, right? So is it, I remember one of the kids said, why do you say thank you to Siri? And I try to say thank you to Siri when I ask Siri something. And because it's part of a practice of saying thank you. It doesn't matter that it's the computer or whatever. Or once somebody saw me on Shabbat morning, I was with the twins going to synagogue. They were little, so they're up to I don't know how old they were. Under 10, they were probably 6 or 7 or 4, 5 or 6. They were old enough to walk with me to shul. And we crossed Derech Hebron, this big 2-lane on both sides with a divider in the middle highway to get to where we were going. And Shabbat morning at 8 o'clock, there's nobody on the street. And so nobody stopped, there's no cars on that street. So I'm there and I'm waiting with them with, both in my hands. And of course, we don't push the walk, but we're waiting for the walk thing to go. We were Orthodox at the time. And somebody goes by and says, why are you stopping? I said, because obviously the girls need to see that you don't walk when it's red, right? So in other words, it's building a culture of doing something. Maybe that was not a great example. In any case, so it's the same thing. You don't think that when you've done one mitzvah, you've really fulfilled. Doing one mitzvah creates a world of doing mitzvot. And when you've sinned, don't think to yourself, well, it's just one. No, because once you do one, that opens up the door to many others. And that addresses the idea of when a soul sins unintentionally. All right, give me 1 second here. We have I've got to, sorry, I'm sorry, I apologize, 1 minute.
Just lubricants.
Yes, we're done with this.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. It's the G-page,
Okay, sorry, I didn't realize anyway, maybe we should move ahead. We want to get to the section that talks about our verses now, okay? So go ahead, Dan. We're at the middle paragraph. About him, it is stated.
About him it has been stated, and one who hastens with the feet is a sinner. So also in Proverbs, that are verses, 6 things the Lord hates: haughty eyes, a heart plotting thoughts of deceit, feet quick to run to evil. This refers to Ahab ben Kaliah and Zedekiah ben Maaseiah, the false prophets of Jeremiah, who sinned in Jerusalem. And that was not enough for them, but after they had gone to exile in Babylon, they added to their sin.
Okay, so telling us, bringing up something from, here's the speaker, he says, you know what, this is like that verse in Proverbs that we were using before, that's similar to the verse in Proverbs that we had today in our section. And you know who plays out that, you know who fulfills that verse? Those 2 false prophets who are mentioned in Jeremiah. It doesn't say exactly what they did in the book of Jeremiah, other than they were false prophets. And that's part of, yeah. So let's go ahead.
What had they done in Jerusalem? They were false prophets. Moreover, they did not forsake their trade in Babylon. Now they would pimp for each other. Ahab would go to visit one of the great ones of the kingdom and would say to him, I am so and so a prophet, the Holy One, blessed be he, has sent me to say something to your wife. So his interlocutor would say to him, here she is before you, go on in. When he was alone with her, he would say to her, the Holy One, blessed be he, wants to raise up prophets from you. Simply go, have intercourse with Zedekiah, and give birth to prophets from him. So he would come and have intercourse with her. Then Zedekiah would similarly pimp for Ahab, and this was their trade for several years.
All right, so they got something going on, right? By the way, for those that know a little bit about apocryphal literature, anything? This is very similar, very reminiscent of Susanna. That one chapter introduction to the book of Daniel that we find in the Greek version, the Septuagint. There's 2 judges there also that are interested in and working together so that they can lay with this beautiful woman whose name is Susanna Shoshana. Okay, in any case, by the way, that brought, no, never mind. Sorry. So it's amazing how much stuff is coming back to me though. All the pages that I had written, the footnotes that I'd written, there's a connection between this and Susanna, I'm sure as well. But let's go back to this. So it gives the background. This is what they did in Jerusalem. This is what they did in Babylonia. Now go ahead.
Let's see how wicked they were. They gave themselves a reputation in Babylon for being great prophets. When some woman became pregnant and saw one of them, she would say to him, if you're a prophet, what's in my womb, a male or a female? He would say, a male. Then he would go to her neighbors and say, so and so will bear a female. If she bore a male, she would say, so and so, the prophet told me. If it was a female, the neighbors would say, thus did so and so the prophet tell us, but he did not want to worry you.
Okay, a little bit complicated, but you get the idea here, right? So, and you understand the impetus for saying there's 6 things like this, but this is 7th. And everything. These guys were bad. Not only were they bad in Jerusalem, but they continue to be bad in Babylonia. Not only were they bad with that kind of thing, which you think would be the worst of the worst, but they were even cruel. They were cruel to these young women, giving birth. And now go ahead. This may be this come and see may be an interpolation from another. This is the kind of thing that I think the copier of the manuscript may have put in here because he said, oh, there's something else they did, because it's kind of anticlimactic. They did the pimping from a sexual point of view. That's really what they're doing here is not as bad as that. At least it seems to me. But now we get back on track to the pimping part. Go ahead.
Now they acted in this way till they came to Shemira, the wife of Nebuchadnezzar. Zedekiah said to her, the Holy One, blessed be he, has sent me to you. Simply go, have intercourse with Ahab, and give birth to prophets from him. She said to him, I may not do this without the agreement of my husband. Rather, let him come and let him inform us that he wants this thing. She
Keep
went to
going.
her husband. Continue.
Yeah, go ahead.
And told the matter to Nebuchadnezzar. So he called for them, and they both came. And he said to them, is this what you said to my wife? They said, yes, as the Holy One, blessed be he, wants to raise prophets from her. He said to him, but have I not heard about your God that he hates licentiousness? And that as a result of that which Zimri breached sexual mores, 24,000 men fell. And you tell me this? Perhaps he recanted? I don't know if you are false prophets or true prophets, but I've already tested Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and I burned the fiery furnace for them for 7 days and threw them inside, and they came out alive and well. But for you, I will only burn it for one day and throw you inside. If you're saved from the furnace, I'll know you're certainly true prophets and will do whatever you say according to your testimony.
Okay, so finally they've come to, the gig is up, right? Somebody's caught on to him, right? Nebuchadnezzar, you see, aside from being the evil king of Babylonia, he's a bit of a Talmid Chacham. He knows his stuff. He knows his Torah portions. He knows, did God change God's mind, kind of a thing. It's facetious. The story's told in a great way. It's a great story, but it's not over yet. Go ahead.
He said to him, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were three, and we're two, and the miracle is only done for three. He said to them, is there a third person like you? They said, Yehoshua, the high priest, thinking in their hearts they would be saved by his merit. They brought Yehoshua, the high priest, and threw him into the furnace with them. The two of them were burnt to death, and Yehoshua, the high priest, was saved, as stated in Zechariah. Is this not a brand pulled out of the fire?
Right, which has nothing to do with the verse in Zechariah has nothing to do with Yeshua the high priest, but it's a way of giving a proof text to prove what the story was about, right? The two of them were burnt by Nebuchadnezzar, the other one came out all right. And continued.
And from Ahav and Zedekiah, a curse was taken for all of the exile of Judah in Babylon, saying, may God make you like Zedekiah and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon consigned to the flames.
Keep going.
Who caused these wicked ones to be burned? It was because they ran with their feet towards abominations and sins. It is therefore stated in Proverbs 19, and one who hastens with the feet is a sinner. Nevertheless, also a soul without knowledge is not good. Therefore, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, say unto Israel, when the soul sins by mistake, the soul sins.
So the connection between this story and Proverbs is not an exact one, but if you parse it out and you parse, I think, the story of Susanna out, you see that this is kind of a way to illustrate a particular dictum from the book of Proverbs. We have, there are stories all throughout Midrash Haggadah, through the rabbis' Midrashim, that will illustrate a particular something in the Torah, which may or may not have to do with the plain meaning, the contextual meaning of the biblical text, though, that way that we have it. And by the way, this is like a third of the homily. I cut it down. But I wanted to bring this because Dan and I have been talking over the years about those two things we mentioned a few weeks ago as well, Midrash Tomech and Midrash Yotzer. There are Midrashic traditions that are supporting something, either a view that already exists or a practice that already exists. Or is it a Midrash Yotzer? Is it a creative Midrash where people actually didn't know, well, what do we think about this? What do we do in this case? Oh, let's go to the verse and say, well, that verse says this, this. In other words, that will lead us down the right path. In my humble experience, the small minority of the Midrashim were like that where they really didn't know what to do and they decided, let's put two and two together and see what we get. More, it's we already know four. Let's see how we get to what we add in order to get to four. And that was kind of the background I wanted to share with you. Now, this is less successful than I thought it would be. For some reason, I thought it would flow a little bit more, but it shows me a little bit just how contextual Midrash is when it's taken in its entirety. What most of us, or most of you, I think, the exposure you have to Midrash is very much a little quote, or a digested kind of a version of it. Not all of you, some of you have experience with that. And that's a huge, that's a wide gap. And it's kind of that's my challenge to figure out how to bridge that gap in a way that I think is better than how this went today, at least in my view, my feeling. So any final comments? Where I know we're a few minutes off after time, but so, Roberta, we just unmute first. You probably have something important to say, but
It's very convoluted and very complex. Is it meant to be so that the study would take years and years? I mean, the minutia of detail is amazing.
Lama davar domeh. To what can I make a parable to what you just said right now? If you were to write a short story, right? Let's take short stories in this book, which I haven't read yet, but I'm going to read before Hanukkah. Again, you can order your copies from us, or you can. I have some in the back of my car ready to bring them to you. But if you write a story here in the desert about crime families or about Palm Springs, whatever, there's a certain amount of knowledge you know because you live here, you live it, and so the story makes sense. The TV shows that we see that are from our culture that we're well versed in American culture, they make sense. We may think they're in poor taste, we may think the acting is not great, but they kind of make sense. The ones that are harder, I think, for many of us are when we see an Asian TV series, for instance, beyond the wall of the language, and we have to read the subtitles, are also cultural things, right? Things that they're not nearly as funny, or they're not nearly as complete. I think that's the approach. This would be, this midrash was written in a world where this was the context, cultural context. And so the bringing of things together was something that was done. The pieces, the building blocks were known. People heard the verse, they heard the Torah reading, they heard other rabbis speak, and then it's brought together. If it was written afterwards, written for a certain group of people that were the studies of Torah. So it's not as if people had to prepare like we do, right? To prepare in order to understand, to decode these texts, right? The texts were written in that cultural milieu. And so I think that's probably the best I can do to explain that. Any other, Malka, you want to help me out here? From your experience?
Just from what you presented today, I think if you don't know the biblical text, then you'd be completely lost. I had to think about some of the biblical references myself in my mind, and then I said, oh, wait a minute. I think you were correct about the cultural milieu and the body of knowledge that they brought, when they were the Darshan, when he was speaking to people that had a body of knowledge that all of us probably necessarily don't have.
And it's not as if they went to university to get that knowledge, Roberta. They didn't necessarily go to yeshiva. That's what they spoke about. Those are the stories that they knew. We have this whole body of knowledge that we have because we read the newspapers, we watch TV, we listen to the radio. Okay. Well, anything else? Well, thank you for indulging me in my nostalgia of a wannabe academic, and bringing me back to those other years. If it does give me the feel I'd like to go back to some of these Hebrew texts one day and go through them again and look at all the notes. Oh, I know that in my Tanchuma, there's in pencil, I have notes galore over the entire page in my first preparations of this, but of course, I can't find those books right now, but one day I will. Thanksgiving to all of you and all the celebrations of the next few days. All of you who have helped out with Jews Do the Blues. Thank you, Tanya, for doing this right now. I think everybody, not everybody knows that Madalena, who's right now in Madrid working out something for her stepmother, Madalena's father passed away on Friday. And we said Kaddish for him over Shabbat, and there'll be a time when we'll do something in his memory, his honor, a study session, and we'll get to hear from Madalena maybe a little bit about Jesus and his life. But she's doing an enormous amount now, long distance for Jews Do the Blues. So I know that many of you will see on next Wednesday night, and Madalena won't be there and Danya won't be there, so I'm still wondering who's going to solve all the seating and ticket issues that seem to come up every time. So please, whatever it is, please just be understanding that we're low on staff this year, and but thank you to everybody who supported us financially, and we'll see you. We'll see you. So we'll send out a notice, but I don't think we'll see each other for many weeks now. Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah.